Demotic Greek or dimotiki is the modern vernacular form of the Greek language. The term has been in use since 1818. Demotic refers particularly to the form of the language that evolved naturally from ancient Greek, in opposition to the artificially archaic Katharevousa, which was the official standard until 1976. The two complemented each other in a typical example of diglossia until the resolution of the Greek language question in favor of demotic. Basic features of demotic. Demotic Greek differs from varieties of ancient Greek and learned forms inherited from the same in several important ways. Syntactically, it favors parataxis over subordination. It also heavily employs redundancy, such as mu iota kappa rho omicron rho iota tau sigma alpha kappa iota and chi alpha nu alpha kappa omicron iota mu eta theta eta kappa epsilon pi alpha lambda iota. Somewhat in connection with this, demotic employs the diminutive with great frequency, to the point that many demotic forms are in effect neuter diminutives of ancient words, especially irregular ones, e.g. nu eta sigma iota from ancient nu eta sigma omicron sigma. Greek noun declensions underwent considerable alteration, with irregular and less productive forms being gradually replaced by more regular forms based on the old one, alpha nu tau rho alpha sigma for ancient nu eta rho. Another feature was the merging of classical accusative and nominative forms, distinguishing them only by their definite articles, which continued to be declined as in ancient Greek. This was especially common with nouns of the third declension, such as pi alpha tau rho iota sigma, which became nominative eta pi alpha tau rho iota delta alpha, accusative tau eta pi alpha tau rho iota delta alpha in demotic. Another feature of the evolution of demotic was the near extinction of the genitive plural, which was revived in Katharevousa and is now productive again in demotic. A derivative feature of this regularization of noun forms in demotic is that the words of most native vocabulary end in a vowel, or in a very restricted set of consonants S and N. Exceptions are foreign loans like mu pi alpha rho, and learned forms upsilon delta omega rho, and exclamations like alpha chi. Many dialects go so far as to append the vowel e to third-person verb forms, gamma rho alpha phi omicron upsilon nu epsilon instead of gamma rho alpha phi omicron upsilon nu. Word final consonant clusters are also rare, again mainly occurring in learned discourse and via foreign loans, alpha nu theta rho alpha chi and mu pi omicron chi. Indirect object is usually expressed by sigma epsilon with the accusative, where ancient Greek had epsilon sigma for accusative of motion toward, where sigma epsilon is used without the article to express indefiniteness, duration of time, or contracted with the definite article for definiteness, especially in regards to place where a motion toward, or with the genitive, especially in regards to means or instrument. Using one noun with an unmarked accusative article noun phrase followed by sigma epsilon contracted with the definite article of a second noun distinguishes between definite direct and indirect objects, whether real or figurative, e.g. beta alpha zeta omega tau omicron chi epsilon rho iota mu omicron upsilon sigma tau omicron epsilon alpha gamma epsilon lambda iota omicron, or sigma tau eta phi omega tau iota alpha. By contrast, Katharevousa continued to employ the ancestral form epsilon sigma place of sigma epsilon. The verb system inherited from ancient Greek gradually evolved, with the old future, perfect and pluperfect tenses gradually disappearing. They were replaced with conjugated forms of the verb epsilon chi omega to denote these tenses instead. the future tenses and the subjunctive and optative moods, and eventually the infinitive, were replaced by the modal tense auxiliaries theta alpha and nu alpha, used with new simplified and fused future subjunctive forms. In contrast to this, Katharevousa employed older perfective forms and infinitives that had been for the most part lost in the spoken language, but in other cases it employed the same aorist to perfective forms as the spoken language, but preferred an archaizing form of the present indicative, e.g. kappa rho upsilon pi tau omega for demotic kappa rho upsilon beta omega, which both have the same aorist form epsilon kappa rho upsilon psi alpha. Demotic and Standard Modern Greek. Demotic is often thought to be the same as the modern Greek language, but these two terms are not completely synonymous. Although demotic is a term applied to the naturally evolved colloquial language of the Greeks, the modern Greek language of today is more like a fusion of demotic and Katharevousa. It is not wrong to call the spoken language of today demotic, but such a terminology ignores the fact that modern Greek contains, especially in a written or official form, numerous words, grammatical forms and phonetical features that did not exist in colloquial speech and only entered the language through its archaic variety. Besides, even the most archaic forms of Katharevousa were never thought of as ancient Greek, but were always called modern Greek, so that the phrase modern Greek applies to demotic, standard modern Greek, and even Katharevousa. Examples of modern Greek features that did not exist in demotic. The following examples are intended to demonstrate Katharevousa's features in modern Greek. They were not present in traditional demotic and only entered the modern language through Katharevousa, where they are used mostly in writing, but also orally, especially words and fixed expressions are both understood and actively used also by non-educated speakers. In some cases, the demotic form is used for literal or practical meanings, while the Katharevousa is used for figurative or specialized meanings, e.g. phi tau epsilon rho omicron for the wing or feather of a bird, but pi tau epsilon rho upsilon chi for the wing of a building or airplane or arm of an organization. Words and fixed expressions epsilon nu delta iota alpha phi epsilon rho omega nu tau omicron upsilon lambda alpha chi iota sigma tau omicron nu tau eta nu alpha pi eta gamma epsilon epsilon iota nu alpha iota gamma omicron nu omicron sigma omicron tau iota pi rho omicron sigma tau omicron pi alpha rho omicron nu iota pi tau omega tau alpha sigma chi epsilon iota rho alpha sigma mu omicron upsilon. Adapted from the ancient Greek phrase describing Pontius Pilate washing his hands at Matthew chapter 27 verse 24. For actual hand washing, the demotic phrase is pi lambda epsilon nu omega tau alpha chi epsilon rho iota alpha mu omicron upsilon. Especially dative forms, delta omicron chi alpha tau omega theta epsilon omega epsilon nu omicron mu alpha tau iota omicron iota of sigma mu epsilon tau rho eta tau omicron iota of sigma epsilon nu sigma upsilon nu epsilon chi epsilon iota alpha epsilon nu tau omega mu epsilon tau alpha chi upsilon epsilon nu alpha gamma nu omicron iota alpha sigma upsilon nu tau omicron iota sigma alpha lambda omicron iota of sigma epsilon pi iota tau omega epsilon rho gamma omega tau omicron iota of sigma epsilon kappa alpha tau omicron iota delta iota omicron iota of sigma chi epsilon rho sigma iota. Grammatical features: adjectives ending in omega news, omicron upsilon sigma alpha omicron nu, or in omega nu omicron nu, mostly in written language. declinable aorist participle e.g. pi alpha rho alpha delta omega sigma alpha sigma gamma epsilon nu eta theta epsilon iota sigma, mostly in written language. Reduplication in the perfect, e.g. pi rho omicron sigma kappa epsilon kappa lambda eta mu epsilon nu omicron sigma pi epsilon pi alpha lambda alpha iota omega mu epsilon nu omicron sigma. Phonological features. Modern Greek features many letter combinations that were avoided in classical Demotic. Pi tau, Demotic preferred phi tau. Kappa tau, Demotic preferred chi tau. Epsilon upsilon delta, Demotic preferred epsilon upsilon tau. Sigma theta, Demotic preferred sigma tau. Chi theta epsilon sigma. Yesterday, Demotic preferred chi tau, etc. Native Greek speakers often make mistakes in these educated aspects of the language. One can often see mistakes like pi rho omicron eta I theta eta instead of pi rho omicron eta I theta eta nu, lambda omicron gamma omicron epsilon tau omicron epsilon omicron tau iota, lambda omicron gamma omicron tau omicron tau iota instead of lambda omicron gamma omega tau omicron epsilon omicron tau iota, tau omicron nu epsilon nu delta iota alpha phi epsilon rho omicron nu alpha nu theta rho omega pi omicron instead of tau omicron nu epsilon nu delta iota alpha phi epsilon rho omicron nu tau alpha nu theta rho omega pi omicron iota epsilon nu delta iota alpha phi epsilon rho omicron nu tau epsilon sigma gamma epsilon nu alpha iota kappa epsilon sigma instead of omicron iota epsilon nu delta iota alpha phi epsilon rho omicron epsilon sigma gamma epsilon nu alpha iota kappa epsilon sigma omicron psi eta phi omicron sigma instead of eta psi eta phi omicron sigma. However, the educated ones do not make mistakes often. Radical demoticism. One of the most radical proponents of a language that was to be cleansed of all educated elements was Yanis Psycharis, who lived in France and gained fame through his work My Voyage. Not only did Psycharis propagate the exclusive use of the naturally grown colloquial language, but he actually opted for simplifying the morphology of Katharevousa prescription. For instance, Psycharis proposed to change the form of the neuter noun tau omicron phi omega sigma gen. Tau omicron epsilon phi omega tau omicron sigma into tau omicron phi omega tau omicron. Such radical forms had occasional precedent in Renaissance attempts to write in Demotic, and reflected Psycharis' linguistic training as a neo-grammarian, mistrusting the possibility of exceptions in linguistic evolution. Moreover, Psycharis also advocated spelling reform, which would have meant abolishing the 6 different ways to write the vowel I, and all instances of double consonants. Therefore, he wrote his own name as gamma iota alpha nu eta sigma instead of gamma iota alpha nu eta sigma. The standard form of Demotic that developed over the next few decades made more compromises with Katharevousa, and despite acrimony between the Psycharist radicals and the moderates, the radical strand was ultimately marginalized. When Demotic was made official in 1976, the legislation stated that the Demotic used would be without extremist and dialectal forms, the extremism being a reference to Psycharis forms.